scripture reading today comes from Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose up upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Sean. Some of you, a few weeks ago, got the opportunity to meet my wife and my children, and they are here again today, and my father's in town visiting too. So I'm going to talk about my children for a little bit, so just heads up, Greta and Wes, I didn't warn you. So Greta and Wes are now 10 and 7 years old, and it was a funny thing that happened about the time that Greta started to walk. I mean, she started to walk, you know, kind of that Frankenstein walk that little ones get, and she was able to do that, and it really wasn't long after that before I remember the day that we were in our apartment, and I was on my knees looking at her and reaching like this for her to walk to me, and the Frankenstein walk got a little faster, and then she got this big grin on her face, and then fell into my chest, and I wrapped her up in my arms, and I pretended that, like, the weight of her crushing blow into my chest knocked me over off of my knees and onto the floor and onto my back, and I remember that giggle that she made when she felt like she tackled her dad. And I propped her back up, and then she came at me even faster and harder and did it again, knocked me over, and again. She couldn't get enough of this game, and before we knew it, it turned into a little, playful tussling, and then it was this, what she would later call, when she got a little bit older, "Daddy, let's wrestle," she'd say, and she'd get this wild look in her eyes, "Let's wrestle." And it became that game of letting her pin me down and then flipping her over and just that playful roughhousing. Well, then when Wes was born, he saw what Sister did, and then he decided he'd up the ante a little bit. Like, I'm going to try to hit him harder. And then they started tag teaming me, and then it became even more and more of that. And then who can jump from on top of the furniture onto Dad and make him groan as we hit his chest, or the sneak attacks from behind and that kind of thing. And it was a fun thing, but here's the funny thing is, it hasn't gone away. So they're 10 and 7 now, and I still get that every once in a while. "Dad, it's wrestling night." And usually that means you take off your shoes. I take off my glasses, because that made that mistake once. Take off my glasses, roll up the sleeves, on my knees, and it's wrestling time, and it's on, and it's going to happen, and we have fun doing that. But that's what I think of every time I think of wrestling, and every time I think about this scripture, reading this from Genesis, the story that involves some wrestling, and it's a really pivotal moment in the book of Genesis, and particularly in Jacob's life. But before we get to that, I want to rewind just a little bit in the story. If you were here last week, you heard the story of Abraham, the great patriarch of the faith. Abraham is aging rapidly, and his son, Isaac, is now aging. And he says, "It's time for me to get my son a wife." And so if you remember last week, he sends out his chief servant. He goes back to the land of his people, and finds a wife there named Rebekah. And before they leave, they sit down with Rebekah's family. Rebekah's brother Laban is there, and they talk about this. They make a negotiation, and it works out okay. Rebekah says, yes, I'm on board with this. She goes back with the servant, and she marries then Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah start a family together, and they have 2 boys, and they're twin boys. And you probably remember this story if you've done some Bible study and reading in your day. Remember that they are the twins, Jacob and Esau. And even inside their mother's womb, the Bible tells us that they were jockeying for position. They were wrestling in there. There was fighting and kicking and elbowing and trying to get ahead. Somebody was going to be the older brother. Somebody was going to be the more dominant, maybe the alpha in the family. We're told then that Esau is the older brother. He's born first, and that Jacob actually is holding on to his heel, trying to pull him back in when he's born. And the 2 twins come out. And all their lives long, they're very different kind of people. The younger brother, Jacob, he likes to hang out with his mom, right? He likes to be the helper. He's closer to her. While Esau, he's kind of his daddy's boy. He's a hairy, hunter, outdoorsy kind of guy. And they both kind of gravitate to one of their respective parents. Well, what happens then, as you may remember, is that one day Esau comes in from the hunt. He's famished. His brother has just been working with mom, and they've cooked up some stew. And he says, man, that smells good. And he's offered, hey, would you like to trade your birthright and the inheritance for the stew? Yeah, sure, whatever. Does it, but then he doesn't realize that one day younger brother Jacob's actually going to trick dad, too, so that he receives the blessing and makes it official. At that point, they're both now adult men. Esau, the older brother, is furious when he finds out what his brother has done. Jacob's fearful for his life at this point. And he says, Mom, what do I do? She says, go back to the land where I grew up. Go back to my people. Go back to my brother Laban, who we heard about last week. Go back to Laban. Live with him. You can be there in hiding. Live your life. Go. And so he runs. He flees for his life. He's worried that his brother's going to kill him. He goes up to this place. He ends up settling down, lives with Laban and his extended family, ends up having 2 wives, having multiple children, grows a flock for his own, and basically builds an estate for himself. But there's probably something within him. There's this restlessness, and there's this calling to go back to his homeland, where he came from, to go back among his people. There's this loose end, this family member who he has never reconciled with, and it's troubling. And so at some point he decides it's time to go back, come what may. And he has to face the music. This is the moment where he goes back. And that leads us up to our story today. So he gets to this place that would become known as Peniel. And there's this little stream that he has to cross. And so he sends his wives, all of his children, and all of his livestock, and all of his earthly possessions and go across. But he hangs back. He's going to wait till morning to cross over. Filled with all kinds of symbolism, the crossing over, right? This is the moment that he would enter back into the land of his people once again. Going back in, but he knows that the stakes have never been higher if he goes back. He's already set aside a great gift to give to Esau as a peace offering, and he's hoping that he'll accept it when they finally encounter one another. But he stays there. And as the sun begins to go down, we hear about this mysterious figure that shows up. Translation that you heard this morning said it was a man. Scholars are always trying to figure out what this means, but the fact of the matter is this is just going to be one of those biblical mysteries. We're not going to quite be able to grasp who this is that encounters Jacob right there at the water's edge. Is it God? Is it an angel? We don't know exactly, but some kind of divine or semi-divine creature, figure is there. And then the weird thing happens. They wrestle. Huh? I've never gone up to anybody before, no word spoken, and started wrestling. But this is what happens in the story. Again, because it's rich with symbolism. It's supposed to be meaningful. We're supposed to interpret things from this. So they wrestle all night long. Literally all night long, they are wrestling, they're struggling with each other, and they're kind of at this stalemate. It's like they're in the scrum, and their heads are locked in, their arms are locked in, no progress is being made. The sun is starting to come up, and then the angel, we'll call him, strikes Jacob in the leg or on the hip, in the thigh, and he's hurt, he's wounded there, he's injured, but he doesn't go down. And they're still struggled and locked into this, and the angel says, "Let me go." And Jacob, being the headstrong guy that he is, says, "Not until you offer me a blessing." And so they're stuck in this. And finally, "What's your name?" "My name is Jacob." And he says, as you heard, "You will no longer be known as Jacob, but you will be called Israel, because you have striven, you have struggled with, you have wrestled with God and prevailed." Prevailed here doesn't necessarily, I don't think, mean won, but it means you have survived it. You have been through this. And then they finally release. The angel goes away. Jacob limps off. He goes and he crosses now into the land of promise. He rejoins his family, and there in the distance he sees Esau coming toward him with his men. What's going to happen? Is this an ambush? Is Esau greeting him with a knife behind his back? And instead, as they get closer, Esau reaches out and embraces him. Now, there are lots of different ideas about what this whole wrestling thing means. I mean, why the wrestling? Why does this have to happen? What's the significance of that? I think there's a lot of different theories out there about that. Maybe it's that, this is about maybe Jacob wrestling with his faith or his doubt. Maybe it's Jacob wanting that blessing that has been previously promised to him, and now he wants to receive it, so that there has to be a moment of tension before that can happen. But the one that I like best is that this becomes a milestone moment in Jacob's life that prepares him for what he will encounter from then on. Jacob has wrestled and has stayed faithful in the process. He has struggled through this moment and all the tension of the things that he has been and what he was, the sins of the past, the mistakes that he's made, the trickery, he was being a grifter, and now he has found a place where he wants to turn a new leaf in his life. He is ready for this pivotal moment, but before he can enter into the promised land, he needs to have that struggle. He needs to wrestle. He needs to come clean with God, and it happens in a very physical and metaphorical for us kind of way as we see this event taking place. It's prepared him for the journey ahead. And after this has happened, after this experience, then he crosses over and lives his life, which is not, by the way, without further challenges. But perhaps he's better able to face them because of this experience that he's had wrestling. When I think about Jesus and his ministry, it's interesting sometimes to step back and to say, why did Jesus take on 12 disciples? I mean, could not have Jesus done the ministry that he wanted to do without adding 12 tag-alongs with him to be his apprentices? I mean, wouldn't that have been just as well? Wouldn't that have been faster if Jesus could have done more ministry without these people following him along the way? But he chose them specifically for a reason, and all along the way, he taught them, he mentored them, he was with them, he guided them, he shepherded them, and he taught them how to, I would argue, wrestle. Because as they met resistance, as they met their challenges, as they met their hang-ups along the way, each time Jesus would have a teachable moment with them where to say, and he said to them, this is something where we can now stop. We can struggle with this, we can get through it, and we can move on and be better for having done that. When Jesus does this all the time, but particularly we find so many stories of Jesus wrestling with the Pharisees, or with the scribes, and with others who will offer pushback and challenge with them, and Jesus wants to wrestle with them, right? This theological wrestling, this understanding of wrestling for what justice looks like, what it means to be a member of the household of God and a citizen of God's kingdom. Jesus is modeling that for them, but they're wrestling in the process. So why? so that after the ascension, they are the ones who are able to take what is the movement of Christ's good news forward into the world. They are able to do this because they have wrestled, because they have been trained, because they have been conditioned then to face the future that is ahead of them. And that's why I think that if we go back to a story and say, why in the world is the story about wrestling in Genesis? It makes sense to me that it serves as a moment of overcoming an obstacle, of tension, of grappling, and maintaining one's faith so that we can encounter what is yet ahead. So one night when Greta and Wes were younger and they were wrestling with me, Eleanor sat on the couch with her arms crossed, watching, kind of shaking her head, going, I don't get it. I don't get it. It's like they were born and just knew how to do this. Like somehow they were just supposed to wrestle because that's just in their DNA. And some of you know what I'm talking about. You've done the exact same thing. Maybe most of you, if not all of you. And so she does what you do, right? Reaches for the laptop, puts it on, opens it up, Googles it. Why do kids like to wrestle with their fathers? And she gets these articles that come back. And hey, guess what? Turns out there's something to it. You learn safety. You learn limits. You learn trust. Kids knew that they could push as far as they would, but I would not let them get hurt. Not seriously hurt. I'm not saying they didn't have tears somewhere along the way, but they learn limits. And we learn that trust, and we learn how far is too far, and we learn about each other. But the funny thing is it's also a key process in the development of children's brains to learn how to safely roughhouse. It's part of how we're meant to be. And I would argue to you today that our faith works in the exact same way, that faith development for us happens not because we are spoon-fed everything that we're supposed to believe, but that we are part of a faith community that encourages asking questions, that encourages reading the scriptures for yourself, that encourages critical thinking, multiple sources, being in conversation. And those are the things that help us to grow because we have wrestled with them. We are stronger for them. And guess what? When the world throws further challenges at us, we will be able to work through those experiences, continuing to uphold our faith because we have been prepared for this and conditioned by our faith, because we took the time to wrestle. I look forward to our future. But I know that every time of transition and change in the life of a church is going to call for some wrestling. There's going to be some of that. There's going to be some of the struggles of getting to know each other. Man, I have already wrestled our Xerox machine. There are things that are just going to take some time. But that's how we build the relationships. That's how we get stronger. That's how we work ahead. And that's how, when challenges in our lives and in the world around us confront us in the future, we will work through them together because we have done our homework. We have done our wrestling, and our faith will be strong and steadfast throughout that because we took the time to be conditioned. But I also take heart knowing that whatever the future holds, that much like the story tells us from Genesis, that no matter what we encounter, when we approach it as people of faith and as the community of Christ, we will emerge on the other side of this. Will you pray with me? God, we may not think of ourselves as wrestlers.